Great. I think Alistair will regret having given me your attention in the microphone, but I will do my best to keep this moving along. So we are, after lunch, after those amazing discussions we all had, we're going to talk a little bit about the first 10 years after a medical sciences degree. I think it's one thing to sort of envision what you may be doing 25 years down the road, and it's a lot harder to know what to do right after you've left Oxford, what you want to do next year, the year after that. And as someone who has absolutely no clue what he wants to do, I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So I think we might just kick it off with a little bit of an introduction from each of the panelists, sort of where you're at now and maybe your thoughts on what you did in your first 10 years or what you're doing now in your careers. So Jazz, can you kick it off?
Okay. Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much. So I did a postdoc here in Oxford. And I worked with some phenomenal people, Dennis Noble and Trevor Powell, doing cardiac electrophysiology. And I found I was learning more and more about less and less. And I wanted to get more translationally focused, have greater impact. So I went off to work in industry. And I joined a company called Glaxo, now called GlaxoSmithKline. I have to say, as a young postdoc, I was full of myself. I thought drug discovery was going to be easy. But I worked in GSK for many years, and I learned that there was so much I just had no idea about. And so that was a wonderful experience. I came back to Oxford 8 years ago, and what I'm trying to do now with the support of people like John is trying to come up with new targets for drug discovery. We're doing this in a very disease-agnostic way, so it could be cancer or inflammation or metabolic disease or neuroscience or indeed rare diseases. I actually believe the way we're doing drug discovery is incredibly inefficient, and so what we're trying to do is change the ecosystem for drug discovery.
Hi everyone, I'm Rachel Carroll. I was actually here almost exactly 10 years ago. I left, so I just got my gaudy invitation actually a couple of days ago, so this is kind of a nice moment to come back and take stock of the last 10 years. So I actually I feel like slightly a bit of a fraud on this panel. It says 10 years after medical science. I've never studied medical science or anything remotely related to that in my life. I actually did international development. My undergrad was in linguistics, so I think I'm probably one of the very softest people in the room in terms of my academic background. And it was a huge surprise to me that I ended up in healthcare. So I think that's probably quite different to a lot of you who were starting from a much more precise point from where I did. But I am someone who was always multidisciplinary to a fault. So I did a double undergraduate degree. I then came here and I didn't want to be tied down, so I did international development because I could do anthropology and economics and politics and other things all in the same degree. I then went to McKinsey because, again, I didn't want to be tied down. I wanted to keep my options open and learn as much as possible. And there they made me do retail and banking and oil and gas and finance and a whole range of different things because that's what they do. And I worked in many different countries all around the world. For several years, I was there for 6 years. And then only at the end, in the last kind of 2-3 years of that, did I stumble into healthcare, and I had never really had anything to do with healthcare. And to be completely honest with you, the reason I got into it was because I really, really, really liked the people that were working on it in McKinsey, and I just wanted to work with them. And so as I got deeper and deeper into this, I found that, to my surprise, I loved it. I thought it was absolutely fascinating. I then got the chance to go and work in the NHS as a manager for a year and a half, so I did that. Originally turned down that job actually because the job was running strategy for London and the NHS, and at that time it was fairly boring looking over strategic plans. So I turned down the job initially, and about 3 days later the coalition, new government coalition white paper came out, and the commissioning structures of the NHS were totally abolished. You know, they were completely ripped up, and all of a sudden this strategy job, which looked like it was very boring, actually became incredibly difficult and chaotic and exciting. And so I got back and said, you know, that job I turned down, actually I'm interested now. And so I went and did that and worked on these reforms, which were terrible, and my job was to make them not terrible. And so I did that for 1.5 years, and then had a great opportunity to go and be the CEO of a healthcare organisation, a startup, which was operating at the intersection of e-commerce and internet and healthcare. And it was about delivering primary care services over the internet. And it had been going for a few years, but was relatively small, and they needed someone to go and grow it. So that's what I did for 3 years. And I've recently left that. My 3 years were up in July of this year, and I'm now managing director of an IVF clinic just off Harley Street. So now I'm sort of going further into specialising into healthcare, now a particular field, and mainly fertility.
Great.
Hi, my name is Susanna Gasser, and I'm currently doing neuroscience research at the University of Cambridge, where I focus on the neurobiology of autism, basically understanding how mutations and the connections between neurons can lead to the cognitive dysfunction we see in these disorders. I also enjoy supervising some Cambridge undergraduates and being their first and possibly only exposure to research science. Prior to moving to the UK a year ago, I also saw patients with autism, particularly adolescents and adults who have either limited verbal or non-verbal. And so basically I did a DPhil in Oxford here in neuroscience, and then went to medical school for 4 years, then did 4 years of internship and residency in neurology, and then a 2 to 3 year kind of combined clinical fellowship. So if we start adding, I think that comes up pretty close to 10. So I think for those of you who are thinking about physician-scientist tracks, the first 10 years really kind of incorporates a time of not just learning the different skills you need, but also trying out ways of combining them for those who are interested in doing teaching, research, and clinical practice.
So I'm another cat amongst the pigeon. So I've studied biomedicine. I knew from a very early point that I didn't want to see any patients, but I was incredibly interested in the questions and problems that medicine and biology posed. So I got a bit confused. So I started out with a hardcore year of mathematics and then started to study biomedicine. I then went to Canada to study ethics and various philosophical sort of topics. Came back to Sweden, where I'm from the beginning, and started my PhD in a clinical department because I felt that I tracked away from medicine too far. So I shadowed the entire endocrinology course that the medical students did in parallel with my PhD. That saw an incredible opportunity to marry my interest in math and computers with the medical questions. So nobody in my lab did that, so I was like a little bit of the odd one out. So I got all the weird sort of association data and linkage data where you look at large families and cohorts to sort of track genetic variants that run in families with disorders. So my supervisor at the time had a collaboration with a lab in Boston, which is now the Broad Institute, but back in the day it was the Genome Center under the Whitehead Institute. So I had the great opportunity to spend half my PhD there under the supervision of Eric Lander and David Altschuler. So that was an incredible time and gave me an incredible appetite for research. So I came back to Sweden, but very quickly got itchy for more international sort of exposure. So I came to the Wellcome Trust Center for Human Genetics at the dawn of the genome-wide association studies, and have had such an incredible track here. So I decided very early on that for me, scientific freedom and discovery is something that I valued. So I've gone through the fellowship route here in Oxford. And then 3 years ago, I got the opportunity to go back to the Broad Institute. So I've been there for the last 3 years, and I just came back a couple of weeks ago. And I'm almost, I'm 11 years after my PhD, I think, if I calculate. So I'm a little bit too old to be on the panel, I think, as well. But and I'm setting up a group here at the Big Data Institute and at the Wellcome Trust Center for Human Genetics. So my research theme is around genetics and genomics of obesity and correlated traits, with a particular interest in human reproductive health because it's so closely correlated. And that's what my lab is doing.
Before I jump in with the long list of my own questions, I might take a page from John's book and open it up to what I'm sure are much better questions from the audience. So does anybody have any initial questions they want to kick off with for these people?
Well, I would definitely encourage many more of my colleagues in Oxford to go and work in industry. I absolutely believe that all of us working in academia and biotech and pharma, we have the same sort of aspiration and vision. We want to generate new medicines to help patients, etc. I think each of these stakeholders have got different strengths. I think one of the challenges we have, and I felt it when I was in GSK, and one of the reasons I came back to Oxford was that I think a lot of academics and large chunks of society do not trust people in big pharma. And that's a real problem. But I recognize that pharma is very good at certain things. It's good at things that require scale and infrastructure. So they're good at doing things like high throughput screening and lead optimization, and then the really big clinical studies are phase 2B, phase 3. Biotech is not as good, and academia certainly is not as good. And in academia, we will never get several £100 million to do a phase 3 study in Alzheimer's, for example. We need big pharma to do that. But in academia, there are other possibilities. In academia, there are, sitting here, it's easier for me to work with lots of clinicians, lots of patient groups, access patient material, access patient databases. When you're sitting inside a private company, that's very difficult to do. And also in academia, there are people who have worked on a target or a pathway for the whole of their lives, and they know more about it than anybody else. Now in industry, that just doesn't happen. In big pharma, you work on a project. If after 3-6 months you've not made much progress, you shift on to something else. And that's not a criticism, it's just a challenge that we have. I mean, when you're working in a large private concern, the only thing that matters is delivering products out at the other end. And they're having to sort of focus their money on their best bets, if you like. I would just encourage more of my colleagues to go. I think the one thing that Boston does extremely well is people work in academia and then they'll go off to Novartis and then they'll go and set up a biotech and then they'll go back to MIT or something like this. And it's only by moving around you appreciate each other's perspective, you appreciate each other's strengths, and you develop trust. And that's important.
In our lunchtime conversation, we spoke a bit about the difficulty or near impossibility of leaving academia, working in industry or something, and then coming back to academia. I wonder if anyone has any thoughts about it.
I've come from the Boston area where I think when I started my PhD training, there was this feeling that you couldn't go back and forth. But over the last 10 years, I've really seen some of the major figures in the field of neuroscience go into industry and be able to still do basic science there. I actually just saw the same person come back and speak at Cambridge. And also, I think that there's one, because of the way the funding structures have changed, I think academics have become much more interested in how they can get funding from industry, and that's made, I think, the transition a little bit easier. I still think there's certain there are also a number of like joint programs now, like PhD students who are doing part of their training in pharma and part of their training at, like, say, Cambridge University, where I'm at now. So I think there is increasing flexibility. The other aspect is that because there are a number of people who are looking for academic jobs, but there aren't as many academic jobs, they're actually getting people, like when I was a PhD student, you could have gone directly into a pharma job without a postdoc, but now for some of the more competitive jobs, you need to do postdoctoral training. So I think there's a lot, I've just seen many examples of people who actually have been able to go back and forth at both junior and senior levels.
I would second that. I don't know if people at the Broad would be excited about that, but I think Broad is almost acting as a hybrid between a biotech company and an academic institution. And I think at the Broad there's a large number of people both in the neuroscience part and the cancer part that have gone back and forth between sort of company career and an academic career, and that seems to be working really well. I think it depends on the funding structures you have available, where I think at Oxford University there is a fellowship track, and if you are more than, I think we talked a little bit about that during lunch as well, that if you are more than a certain years after a particular stage or after your education, you won't be eligible for various parts of funding. So that's obviously limiting if you want to go in and out of an academic career. When you're more senior, I think that changes. So I think it sort of depends on how you get funded and what stage of your career you're in and where you are, if that's possible, if that makes sense.
I suppose, and like many people, and John talked about it this morning, I believe the biggest innovations are going to come when we bring people together from different disciplines and different silos and different expertise. And I used the word ecosystem earlier on. I mean, the fact is the University of Oxford on its own, or Pfizer on its own, or GSK on its own, they are not going to discover a new drug for schizophrenia or for Alzheimer's. We're going to have to work together. We're going to have to bring together the best people in academia with the best people in industry. That could be biotechs, it could be farmers. We're going to have to bring lots of funding from various sources. It could be public, private, charitable, philanthropic, whatever. We just need to break down these silos if we're going to make progress in this area. The one thing I would say is and often, we as academics, we sort of look to industry and look to them as a source of funding. Of course, that's, money is always useful, but I try and approach it from the view of what skill sets or what expertise or what infrastructure have they got that we don't have in Oxford. And then by pooling those, then together we have a much greater probability of success. So, I always try and focus on the science. If we can get the problem sorted, create a team around it, the funding always follows.
I was wondering if you might be able to speak to, I know you told great stories about what you did in your first years of your career, but could you speak to maybe the moment or that time when you were in your postgraduate degree that you sort of made the decision as to what you were going to do next? Sort of how you decided that fit with your trajectory or why it seemed to make sense at that time? You can think for a second.
I think for me the moment wasn't so much during my postgrad, it was a little bit afterwards. I was very clear that I definitely wanted to be in business. And so my focus was on doing a DPhil in a very sort of efficient way. I knew I didn't want to go into academia. So actually, I remember sitting in these halls, and when I was deciding whether or not to do the DPhil, maybe a decision some of you might be thinking about as well. And I was on a program where I could convert my MPhil into a DPhil, and a lot of people told me I couldn't possibly do that in less than 2 years. The conversion I meant, and I did, and I did it in 18 months. And the reason I was able to do that was because I was very clear that I didn't want to be an academic, and that allowed me to strip out a lot of the kind of historical sort of performative things that people did when they were DPhil students, like present papers and posters and a lot of that kind of thing, which was great for those people who needed to do that or who wanted to do that. But I was very clear that that wasn't for me. So I could kind of strip away those things. And then when I was, the moment for me that was kind of determinative, or the realization, was when I was leaving McKinsey and trying to figure out what to do next. And I came to the conclusion that I had a kind of two paths laying out in front of me, and one I characterized as an advisory path. So I always thought of this as the kind of person who walks into a room, says really clever things, and then walks out of the room again. And the other path being a more doing and building path. And it was clear to me that in consulting, I was on the advisory, saying clever things path, and actually I wanted to be on the building things path. And so at that point, it became obvious that what I needed to do was leave McKinsey and seek an operational role. So that's what I did.
Susanna?
I think there were really two moments during that first 10 years when I had to make a very discrete decision. The first is obviously finishing medical school and deciding what residency. I'd already done the DPhil in neuroscience, so I'd narrowed it down to neurology or psychiatry, and then adult or pediatric. And at the time it felt like a really kind of like deep deliberation, but it turns out that since I ended up working in autism and neuroscience research, I think I could have got to the same clinical point from either of those specialties, because like a little secret is, as a pediatric neurologist or psychiatrist, you still see adults and vice versa, and there are all sorts of adult trained neurologists and psychiatrists who end up seeing children. So that decision point felt really heavy to me at the time, but then it turned out to all roads led to the same path. But the real decision for me was when I finished residency, because even though maybe half of my peers in neurology had PhDs like myself, most of them chose to stay like almost wholly within the clinical realm to do their clinical research and research like literally in the hospital. And I had done my PhD in a very kind of basic area of neuroscience, and I wanted to return to that. So I had a choice of whether to go with my research interests or my clinical interests, because I actually really enjoyed working with patients with dementia at the time, and I had an offer to do a clinical fellowship that was part clinical, part research at UCSF, which has one of the kind of hottest places for memory disorders, research and clinical work at the time. But so then I decided, I thought, well, I can keep running on the clinical treadmill because it's very easy to do that, and there's a lot of momentum, especially from your peers and advisors. But I think at that point I said I can either keep going on this track, like what everyone's pushing me to do, or I can say, I've been saying for many years now, I wanted to go back and work on that research. And so at that point I decided to go create my own research and clinical fellowship in autism, and then that. So that was a really kind of critical.
I don't think I have a moment, but I think for me, somebody asked about serendipity before, and I really liked that question. I thought that was very thoughtful. I think for me, along my career, as many other people, almost everybody, I've been presented with alternative options. Either getting job offers or seeing job adverts or hearing somebody talk about something, and I have never felt compelled to do anything else than what I'm doing now. And that for me is the strongest key argument to motivate me and reassuring me that I'm on the right path for me, because I'm incredibly content in my job. So I think the biggest moment for me was that I was coming to an end of my fellowship a couple of years, or actually a year and a half ago. So I came to a point for the first time in my life where I actually had to make an active decision. So I entertained discussions with pharma and biotech and a number of different universities, and I thought about it really long and hard. And in that process and in that discussion, it was very, very clear to me that I want to continue to do what I am doing, and I was lucky enough to be able to do that. So I think for me, that's sort of harnessing serendipity in a way. And who knows, we've heard about people doing 2 or 3 careers, which feels incredibly brave, but I haven't reached the point where I feel sort of compelled to do that yet. I don't know if it's an answer, but it's a answer.
Jess?
I suppose we're all different. And, throughout my research career, I've always tried to think about big problems or big hurdles and really think about how we can get there most efficiently, etc. So I would love, in the time I've got left in research, I'd love to come up with a new treatment for Alzheimer's or something like this, and I think that's a massive hurdle. I mean, somebody on the panel this morning said something similar, that they weren't interested in incremental stuff. They wanted to produce a step change. I think the second thing I would say is, I've been privileged to have some phenomenal mentors in my life, but one of the people who I love more than John Bell probably is Tashi Yamada. And I don't know if you guys know Tashi Yamada. He used to be the head of R&D at GSK, and then he became head of R&D at Gates, and then Takeda, and he's just retired. And he always used to say, Chaz, he said, just focus on the patient. And I'm reminded of something that happened to me about a year ago, where a mother of a patient came to see me. Her daughter has a rare GI stromal tumour, so she lives in Bath. This tumour is about 1 in a million, so there's 60 in the UK. And at the same time, her daughter's physician, who lives in Cambridge, came to visit. So the physician and mother are sitting in my office. And eventually the mother starts crying. And I said to the mother, how's your daughter doing? And she said, my daughter's 22 years old, and she's just had the whole of her stomach removed. And I sat there thinking, I have a 25-year-old daughter, and frankly, she's my life. And I thought, how on earth does any parent cope with that? To watch a 22-year-old daughter have their stomach removed. And, the reason she was sitting there was because this is a rare tumour. She knows that big pharma isn't going to invest lots of money. And out of desperation, she comes to speak to a group in Oxford about seeing what we can do to help her. And it's things like that that keep me going. So, I don't know if that answers your question, but a couple of things.
I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on how we can sort of objectively assess the wide range of things we could possibly do once we finish. Given we know that we're always founders, amidst an environment where it seems that many of our peers do a reasonably narrow range of things afterwards. There's a lot of, you look around, you see the people that you like, the people you respect, you see that they tend to go down these paths. How can you sort of stop yourself from following that temptation when you know there's so much more out there?
Tough question.
It's a huge question. How do you assess the options open to you? That's like asking, what should I do with my life? That thousands of years of philosophy has not yet answered that question, so I don't think we're going to today. But I do think, from speaking to many of you, I probably have spoken in some way to about half of you today. I am just so heartened and invigorated and inspired by the way you are all thinking about your careers, and I don't get any sense of narrowness from today. If anything, I think many of you are struggling with the bewildering options that face you, and one of the messages that has come through in all of the conversations that I've had or observed today is how fortunate you are, and how really there are almost no bad choices for many of you, or for most of you, in the options that you have. Also, how the perception of risk that you have is not always grounded in the objective risk that you are actually facing. And in one of the groups that we were that we had, one of the lunchtime groups, we talked about the way that we, all of us who have come on a path where we end up in this hall, we've made often very safe and often prescribed decisions within a framework for us, and that has always worked for us so far, and now you're facing the edge of that framework, potentially, or you're facing more choice than you have had in the past. And that's quite a dislocating, anxiety-producing thing. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't conflate that feeling with risk. And you are facing objective risk, but also you're facing anxiety, which is not necessarily the same thing. And one of the ways that we talked about in one of the groups we were in was to think, perhaps if you were giving someone else opposite you in the table advice in the same situation, would you think that they were facing an enormous amount of risk by taking one of your options? probably you would say, well, no, this is an incredibly smart person, you know, they've got lots of options, they're not going to be destitute, they're not going to be unemployed, they're not going to be homeless. Actually, what's the risk? Well, you are also that person. So think about what counsel you would give each other. And one of the other things I think might be interesting to meditate on is I think Bird's House in some ways does you a great service by not giving you a very lavish stipend. And the reason I say that is because let me personalise this a little bit because your financial situations may vary. So let me just talk about my own situation. I lived entirely on the stipend when I was here. I lived within my means, and it was one of the most golden years of my life, and I'm sure that will be the case. I just had such a great time here. I felt so fulfilled, so happy, which is why I stayed for so long. And to me, I look back on that as a lesson in how that I can be incredibly happy on not a particularly generous amount of money. And that is actually a very good thing to know, because it makes me realise where my flaw is. You know, if I ever find myself in that situation again where I have to live like that, I know I can be perfectly happy. In fact, I can be more than happy. I can be fantastically fulfilled. And so that is quite powerful, because it allows me to think about the risk that I take in my life.
There is an incredibly thought-provoking talk by a professor at the Rutgers University outside of New York. She's a philosophical professor who has also been in Oxford, I think maybe as a Rhodes Scholar or on some sort of scholarship. Her name is Ruth Chang. And she is spending time thinking about the problem of hard decisions. And one of the things she says is that it's not hard to make a choice if one of the options is much better than the others. It's only hard to make a decision if the options and outcomes of your choices are almost equal. And if you're in a situation where you face a difficult decision, so what should I do? It means that you have options, and that most of the options are good. It just means that you have a problem of predicting the exact outcome of your choice, which nobody can guarantee for you. And she has a number of talks that is online that I've seen her talk live, but I know she does online talks as well. And I would encourage everybody who is sort of thinking about these things to look at that. So one of the things she tells people to do if they're sort of anxious about choices is actually to flip a coin, which sounds absolutely ludicrous. To risk your future on the flip of a coin, but she says that if you get disappointed with the outcome, you know the answer immediately. So that's a clever way of thinking about it in a way. So we're all prone to making lists, and you can sit and you make lists and you have like money, location, family, satisfaction, mentorship, curiosity, and all these sort of value statements that you have that you can sort of line up for yourself. But the truth is that you're not anxious about what you have on paper, you're anxious about the unpredictable outcome of it. So you're not stuck in your position. So if you make a choice of your career that you're not happy with, you can always sort of move on, do something else. And I think that sort of on all the panels, what I've reflected as is that people have moved around quite a bit. We've heard people moving from San Francisco to South Africa, to back to America, to Oxford. People have been, traveling in the various educational paths and doing all kinds of different stuff. So you're not stuck. And I think that that's important to remember.
There's a question from the back.
Historically, the United States has always been very good at taking biomedical ideas and innovations and pushing them into businesses or practices or products that can be widely applicable. We've all worked after leaving Oxford in quite a variety of fields, both in the academic and in the commercial side of things. What is the spark that they have that we have less of, perhaps less of here and definitely elsewhere? And how can we bring that spark and to transform this environment and other environments?
I'll make three really quick points and then other people have to say. I think one thing they have is a complete ecosystem. It's very hard to take just one element of the science, the funders, and the eventual purchasers, and you can't create an environment to start really successful companies only having one slice of an ecosystem. You need the whole ecosystem. The second thing is the NHS, while it has many, many wonderful qualities, it's an extremely difficult environment for startups who want to sell in the UK. It is, the procurement cycles are extremely long. They can be kind of 2 years. By that time, biotech tends to be slow-moving startups anyway, but by that time, many startups have run out of cash. So it's very different in a situation where you don't have a single payer. And I forgot my third point. Those are two.
I don't know whether this answers your question, but my sense is that in the US, certainly on the West Coast and probably in Boston, there's a lot of very young, ambitious, hungry, driven people who are willing to take risks. And they're not afraid of failure. Many of them will write a business plan. Even before that's funded, they're already writing number 2 and 3. And in the UK, we're still a little bit sort of, I write one business plan and I try and get that funded, and if I don't get that funded, I never write another one. So I think there's a sort of a culture piece there, but I think it is just down to risk-taking. And, you know, and even with respect to the earlier question about sort of career choices, I mean, my sense is all of you guys, all of you girls are so incredibly smart. You will be successful, whatever you do. You know, and at your age, these are just different experiences. Just seize them. And if you take on one and after a year you're not enjoying it, you're not tied down to it, you can shift off to something else, etc. So I would just say relax, be confident, enjoy the ride, and it'll be great fun.
Before we go to concluding questions, I had one thing I wanted to bring up, and it was Kathy's excellent point this morning, and that idea of failure, which you touched on there. And I was wondering if you might be able to speak to maybe a point in the early parts of your career where you failed or you had a hurdle that was particularly difficult to get over, and sort of how you might have come back from that and moved forward in your careers. You can take a minute to think.
Well, let me share this with you. It's not a personal example, but so when I was at GSK, there was a guy named J.P. Garnier who was the CEO of the company. And one day a few of us were meeting up with him, and somebody said to him, "JP, what do you look for in a leader?" And everybody thought he was going to say, sort of, you know, passion or vision or intellect or humility or something like this. And JP said, "I look for resilience." He said, you know, what I want is, you know, all of us will make mistakes and things will fail. What I want is people who can pick themselves up, dust themselves off and carry on. And I've never known anybody else to say that, but I thought that was quite a remarkable thing to say.
I don't know if this exactly qualifies as failure, but there have definitely been 2 points in the last 10 years where I seriously questioned spending 8 years invested in the medical side of training in order to be qualified as a neurologist, in order to do 10 to 20% time clinical work. Because during the 4 years of medical school and the 4 years of residency following finishing my PhD, obviously my colleagues who had done PhDs at the same time were doing their postdocs and getting faculty positions, you know, and when I came out, when I left Oxford and started medical school, it was like a huge letdown because I enjoyed, you know, the first year at Oxford, I was like, what's going on in this place? And then the second year, I was like, oh, this is kind of fun. And by third year, I was like, this is the best place on earth. And then I went to medical school, which I am paying right now. But anyways, I was deeply disappointed in like the drop in the intellectual environment. And I think, I mean, I understand the difference in mindset now, but so then I had a serious question, should I have done this? And then again, when I started my postdoc after finishing residency, I thought, oh my, you know, I'm very far behind now, all the basic scientists, and was this worth it to do 10% time? And I spent many years wondering about this, but I do think that, one, I found myself sort of in this niche of working with adolescents and adults with autism, when there are very few people who are trained to do that. And so even though it was only a small percentage of my time, I think those individual, like when I spent, an hour and a half, fortunately we were funded by a charity, so we could spend a lot of time with our patients, or 45 minutes, that's a new patient, and 45 minutes of return. During that space and time with people who every day are living with the societal judgment surrounding them for having a child who's not behaving, who's screaming, hitting, doing all this, to be in that space where they had somebody who really, was not judging them and was offering them potential solutions, I found to be very immensely rewarding. But I also know that I'm the type of person who I can't really do clinical work full time. It's too emotional for me, and I really enjoy the intellectual stimulation in the lab. And so I began to feel okay. Well, maybe most people might not be happy with 8 years investment for 10% time, but actually it was a personal experience that I had completely unrelated to the training, which was one of my grandparents was in a car accident and had a very serious neurologic injury. And I sat with my extended family as a neurologist and explained to them, so that they could come to a decision about removing care. And I must have had this conversation hundreds, if not thousands of times during my residency with people. And I think at that moment, being prepared to help my family with that decision justified 8 years of work. And sorry, I'm just a very emotional person, so hopefully you as a physician won't lose it, because I feel like a lot of my colleagues, when confronted with the pain in medicine, lose that. So anyways, sorry for crying, but I'm very comfortable with people crying around me, so hopefully you will become comfortable with that too. Anyways, but I was just saying, sometimes when you're trying to make these decisions about what's worth it, you're never really going to know what that moment is, which makes it worth it.
So with the risk of sounding callous, I think my most expensive and devastating failure was when I was an intern at the Technical University of Vienna, and I was responsible I worked in the facility for doing monoclonal HIV antibodies, and I didn't balance the centrifuge. And it was a huge centrifuge, so the entire thing, which was the size of this table, just flung through one wall and almost cut the leg of one of the research assistants. I was still an undergraduate, and I was told how much the machine was, how much it would be to repair the wall, and that was my second day at work, and I was very certain that I wasn't going to go into lab science after that. On a more sort of sincere note, sort of on failure, when I came back from America, I was lured into running a core facility for genotyping and sequencing in parallel with my postdoc. And that's not a bad job, but it's a very bad job to run in parallel with your postdoc, and it was a very bad judgment of the people that asked me to do that. However, I'm an incredibly stubborn person, so I managed to get it up and running, and I ran the LIMS system, and I had people doing analyses, and I ran the entire lab crew, and I was hanging in mass spectrometers, and I did all the customer work, and I did a postdoc. So needless to say, my scientific output wasn't brilliant, and it was something I was really stressed about. So then I met one of my mentors, and he was like, "You've gone from publishing these Nature Genetics papers during your PhD to being completely absent. What are you doing?" And I literally panicked, and I was like, "Oh my God, now I have to make a decision." So what I did then was to fiercely pursue my own funding. I went to Oxford, and I started sort of over, almost. I wouldn't say it's huge failure, but for anybody who knows what counts when you're attracting grant money and so forth, it could have been scientific death. So that very early on taught me the lesson of saying no to people when they ask you to do something that you really don't want to do. Saying no is an incredibly difficult, but also incredibly powerful thing to do.
Do you want to say one?
I have so many, I don't even know where to start. Literally, there's no way I could identify one.
You can say one thing.
Well, this is not even one, but I do remember one of my first projects at McKinsey. McKinsey has a very, very strong feedback culture, which can be extremely brutal. and they kind of strip you away and then build you back up again. And I remember my manager in one of my first projects, we would have these formal feedback sessions, which is sort of one-to-one, and I kind of thought he'd say some constructive stuff, maybe 3 things or something, and then I would ponder on them and go away. And he pulled out this piece of paper, and the piece of paper had I could see bullet points, and the entire paper was bullet points, and then he turned it over, the entire other side was bullet points as well, and I knew none of them were positive. They were all constructive. But that was all stuff that I learned from.
That's excellent. This has been so great. Just to wrap it up. Oh, one question? Okay.
One question was, obviously one of the most relevant things in the first 10 years after your medical studies would be not just establishing a career, but establishing a family. And I think to a lot of people, having family strength will give you strength for your career and other things that you're doing. So I'm wondering whether you think you managed it properly, whether you could have done certain things better, because you might have just started a family, you might be a new parent, and a lot of things are happening during this phase of your life. So yeah, I just want to ask whether you had any insights on that. And another related question would be, do you draw a clear line between your work and home? Or do you find that you're really passionate and interested in your work, that your work is part of your life, and you don't think that's necessarily unhealthy to share that with your family, share that as a very core part of your life?
So I'm very much of the Sheryl Sandberg view that one of the most important decisions that a woman can make about her career is who she marries. And so for me, the fact that my husband is feminist, really believes in genuinely sharing all of the stuff that we do, has been absolutely critical. So I have a 1.5-year-old baby, and she's with her right now. She's with him right now. I think actually a few of you have met my baby, because the last time we came here, I brought her along. So it's important to me, to your second question, I don't think about my life in kind of compartments. It's important to me that I live an aligned life where the bits of my life know about each other, and to me the feeling of merging is not a threatening feeling, it's actually a very integrated, aligned feeling. And I very much identify with the second part of your question. I know I'm passionate about something when I want to work on it in the evenings. I very frequently do work on things in the evenings, and it's been years and years since I felt compelled to. At the start of my McKinsey career, yes, I did feel compelled to, and I did it because I had to, but that quickly went away, and if that hadn't gone away, I would have left and done something else.
So I agree with that, having a partner, no matter if you're a man or a woman, actually, if you're going to have a family, you need to have a partner who supports you and supports that decision. So I have 3 kids. I have twin girls who are 2.5 and a boy who's turning 4. And I think when it comes to family, having it or not having it, I don't think ever your work should be the key determinant as to whether you choose to have a family or not. It could be, if it's really important to you. But being nervous about having a family for how work should react, it's just so difficult to know. So it's such a personal thing. I wouldn't have done anything differently. You can't always plan how long time it takes to have a child, or how many children you get. I got twins when I was in Boston. We hadn't planned to have children then. This is incredibly personal, nor did we have planned to have twins. But I'm incredibly glad of them. They haven't impacted on my career. I don't think any of my children have done, because I've been in an incredibly supportive environment from bottom up. Both from students up to mentorship has always been like, just go for it and do what you need to do. And I think the key question should be, do you want to have a family? Have you found the right person to have the family with? And do you think it's worth having it in parallel with the job you have? And I think that's difficult. But if you want to, you should just go for it. There's never a good time, there's never a bad time, and you can't always plan it.
this may be slightly different interpretation of family, but when I started residency, I actually found a family in one of the Harvard University undergraduate houses where they've attempted to kind of recreate the Oxford system. And so, I had a family of 450 undergraduates and about 24 other things, and that formed the community, because I do think that a lot of times we think we can work in isolation, that it's enough to work in the hospital all day and get feedback there and then come home, sleep, and just do whatever, ADLs, as we say in medicine, activities of daily living, get those done and then run back to work. I mean, it's hard to know whether, it just, had to wait for time, but I got married about a little over a year ago to my husband, who I met probably a few months after finishing residency. So I don't know if you find those events correlated, so as to the balance. But what I would say is, one thing that I've observed with my friends who've had children and family during residency and research time, and that I think a lot about now that, I am married and I have another person to be responsible to, is about like where you get the rewards in your work, because it's really can be quite seductive, especially at the medical school and residency level, because the more you try to jump higher, like, they say be here 80 hours, and you're like, no, I'm going to be here 90 hours, like I'm going to do the best job, and the more you try to outdo, you get a lot of rewards from people, right? People are happy when you're relieving them of your work, your patients are happy when you're always there and they don't have to see somebody new, but I see a lot of people take for granted their spouse at home, whether that spouse is another physician or not. And so I've tried to encourage one friend I particularly have in mind that, there's somebody at home who needs your energy too. And I think about that a lot, like when I'm in lab, if I'm staying later and later, am I doing this, how do I balance that? So I don't see them separate, because my husband's a scientist and we talk about science basically continuously at home as well. But I do think you have to be really conscious of like the kind of seductiveness of, people being grateful for your work in the hospital and thinking about, are you giving the same attention at home?
To wrap things up before Alistair cuts us off, I was wondering if, with the advantage of hindsight, you each might be able to give a Twitter-sized piece of advice that you would like to give a younger version of yourself. So think 140 characters.
Be confident and have fun.
Probably all your options are good.
Mentors, curiosity, discovery, hashtag you can do it.
That's good. Great. Thank you all so much. I think this has been really enlightening and personal, and I've really enjoyed it. So I'll toss it back over to Alistair.